Hello, and welcome to Central Booking, where writers and readers are the authority. I'm your host, John Valeri. Today, I'm talking and twinning with freelance entertainment journalist Jim Colucci. Jim is the New York Times bestselling author of Golden Girls Forever, the complete first-ever show retrospective, published in 2016. Many years in the making, the book includes exclusive interviews with on-camera and behind-the-scenes talent, hundreds of photos, commentary, fun facts, and so much more. Oh, and did I mention that he also sat down with stars B. Arthur, Betty White, and Rue McClanahan to get their personal remembrances? Because he did, and we're all a bit jealous of that. Or at least I am. Jim has also written Will and Grace Fabulously Uncensored, the official authorized companion book to the hit TV series, and the Q Guide to the Golden Girls. Additionally, his work has appeared in publications such as TV Guide, Inside TV, Quick and Simple, In Touch, Rosie, The Advocate, Next, and CBS's Watch magazine. He also writes the Must Hear TV blog and has both written for and appeared on television. And speaking of television, September 14th marks the 35th anniversary of the Golden Girls debut episode, and the show, which ran for 7 seasons between 1985 and 1992 and earned each of its leading ladies an Emmy Award, remains omnipresent throughout the world, not only in syndication, but by the multitude of tie-in products that are now available, including clothing, as you're about to see. To celebrate the occasion, Jim sat down with me to share his personal reflections on the Golden Girls and how his passion for the show has influenced his professional pursuits. So grab the cheesecake and settle in. I can almost hear Sophia saying, "Picture it. New Jersey, 1985. Hi, everybody. Welcome to a special edition of Central Booking. I am really quite honored to be in the presence of Jim Colucci today. He is the New York Times best-selling author of Golden Girls Forever, and also a very popular entertainment journalist. So welcome to the show, Jim. Thanks for making time for me.
Thanks, John. I'm glad to be with you tonight.
Yeah, and I guess we should tell people about our shirts real quick, because anybody who's really paying attention is going to see that we're twinning. And yes, this is a Golden Girls shirt. It's from Cakeworthy. And I will admit that I was stalking your Facebook page and I saw it there. And as soon as I saw it, I knew that I had to have it. And here we are.
Well, and I did the same thing to Alaska 5000 from RuPaul's Drag Race, because Alaska was wearing all this Golden Girl stuff from Cakeworthy, and I stalked her page.
And that's all that mystery.
Yes, so I had to have it myself.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, hey, I'm just going to keep following you. You're like a trendsetter, so I'm just going to follow you.
But, follow Alaska. She's the trendsetter.
Oh, I guess that's where I should start, right? Yeah. It's the trickle-down effect. By the time I get around to it, it's not popular or trendy anymore, but... So anyway, I mentioned that you were the author of Golden Girls Forever and also the Q Guide to the Golden Girls. But before we get into those books specifically, I sort of want to start with the obvious. And I have to ask you, where did your fascination, your interest in the Golden Girls, when did that start? And why do you think it's compelled you for all these many years?
I was always a kid who loved TV. I didn't like going outside and playing sports. I loved to be babysat by the TV and turn on the TV after school and do my homework in front of it, but also loved primetime TV. And I'm old enough that I remember when the Golden Girls was in development. I remember reading, I was 15, and I remember reading, there's going to be a new show that's like a super group of comedy. It's going to be Betty White from the Mary Tyler Moore Show, and it's going to be Rue McClanahan and B. Arthur from Maude together on a show about 4 women. Oh my God, I can't wait. And a lot of the press coverage at the time covered it that way. Oh, here's this pilot with some of the most beloved women from television, a super group of talent. And so when that pilot was announced and then filmed in April of '85, and every time it got press, I was eagerly reading, oh my God, what's the latest with that? Is it going to be picked up to series? When's it going to debut? So from the very beginning, I was very excited about that.
Wow, I'm impressed. That is the very, very beginning. I have to say, quite honestly, I wasn't sure that you were old enough to, date back to actually remembering the development, because you look young.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, and it's funny. I can remember, watching the show as a kid in the initial run, and I was between when that was on, probably I was born in '82, so 3. I was between 3 and 10, and I can remember it vividly, more so than probably most of my childhood. And it's so funny now to look at it and realize all the humor that I never understood, but still it spoke to me. But I don't remember anything about the development. But anyway, I wanted to ask you too before we talk about your books. So we are speaking, it's just about the end of September, and so it was just the 35th anniversary of the debut episode last week.
Right.
And so I'm wondering, I now know, where your interest stemmed from, but if you had to say why you think it is that the Golden Girls, has been so popular throughout time and still now is probably more popular than it's ever been, because now there's all this great tie-in stuff, that didn't exist when we were kids watching the show. But what do you credit sort of with the fact that it goes on and on and on and never goes out of style?
I think that for a show to be beloved, it has to accomplish several things. And I think a lot of shows accomplish one or two of these things, but Golden Girls is just that magic. I hate the cliche that TV producers use where they say lightning in a bottle, but that just means the perfect storm, another cliche, of all of the right elements combining together. So when you combine the great writing of the Golden Girls, the great talent of the Golden Girls, where, as I said, it was all these women who were, once in a century talents put together in the same show. Then you add just thematically that for different groups of people, the show hits them in different ways. But for obviously, it was aimed at older women and portraying them in a way that they had never been portrayed before and haven't been portrayed too often since. And so I'm sure that women love the show for that reason, and older women love the show. Oh my gosh, I see myself. I see something that is attempting to make me the glamorous protagonist of a show rather than the old lady joke of a show. So I think for women of all ages, for older women, they see themselves. For younger women, they see the fantasy future they hope to have, where you get to live with your friends, and every day is glamorous, and every weekend you have a date to a different charity ball. And when you wake up at 2 in the morning, you're in full hair and makeup, and you can eat cheesecake without guilt with your 3 best friends. I mean, that I know of a lot of young women for whom to whom that really speaks, because they say, "Oh my God, that idea of girl power and the love of your girlfriends being celebrated. Yes, you can have the men in your life and you can have husbands or whatever, but there's something special about your girlfriend." So young women who lived in sorority houses when I was writing the book and in college would talk about those elements. Then you talk about the LGBT audience, and where we have always, I'm gay myself, we've always built family out of friends because our biological families aren't always the most supportive. And so here are the Golden Girls, only 2 of them are related by blood, and the other 2 are by choice. And they form this really tight-knit family unit where they vow to take care of each other even in sickness. And that's another, wish fulfillment fantasy, that we should all have that wonderful combination of friends in our lives. So I think when you add up all of those things, it's such a potent combination of factors that, yeah, I'm not going to slag any other shows because I love Friends and I love, so many others, Will and Grace, and I think they have a lot going for them too. But I don't know if any other show has all that I named,
Sure.
and that's why I think that it will continue, much like I Love Lucy has. And I don't think any other show has accomplished this. I do think Friends and The Office and a few others will, especially now that they're in streaming reruns where people can find them more easily. But I Love Lucy and The Golden Girls are really the only 2 shows up until this point that have managed to recruit new generations of fans who weren't even alive when the show was on. And that's because of all the things I mentioned.
Yeah, that was very pointed. And I often think about it too, like why is it that I was drawn to this show? And I'm not sure, if I still know. If I had to take a stab at it, I think, I remember weekends I would go to my grandparents and we would watch the Golden Girls together. And, pretty much all of my grandparents passed when I was relatively young. And I feel like, but even when they were alive, that the women were sort of like surrogate grandparents to all us children who were watching, and you see Betty White and you think grandma. Like,
That's right. And that's another group I didn't mention about fans. People who were young at the time and watched it with grandparents, or for whom it reminded them of their grandparents. And it's funny because with all the ageism in Hollywood, and that still exists,
right.
there is such a bond where we miss our grandparents and we want to see them and see them having fun and eating cheesecake and whatever. So not all of us are lucky enough to have known or met our grandparents, but most of us have had an elder in life for whom the Golden Girls is a memory, a reminder, and I think that's great. It's so powerful.
Sure, sure. And so I'm going to ask you, because I mentioned that some people might not know that this actually is your second book about the Golden Girls, and you wrote one that was a little bit more audience, specific back in the mid 2000s, which I believe was the Q Guide to the Golden Girls. So can you tell us, what inspired you to write that book, and whether or not you knew as you were writing it that, some years later you might want to do a deeper dive into the Golden Girls?
That's exactly what happened. I had done a book about Will and Grace, and I love that show too. And that show was in production while I did it, so that was a whole other level of fun because it's like going behind the curtain and watching them make the show. And that was very in-depth and with full color photos, and that's the treatment I always wanted to give the Golden Girls. I wanted it to be as in-depth as I could. I wanted it to be photos that no one had ever seen, and I knew that stuff was out there. It really was for business reasons that I ended up splitting it into two books, and that's because you can write as an author a book about a TV show, and that's fine. You're just writing your opinion and covering it, and you can do interviews. That's all First Amendment stuff. But when you need to use materials that are copyright protected, such as photos or script pages or anything else, that's a whole other level of approvals. And the Golden Girls is owned by Disney. Disney ultimately, 10 years later, was very cooperative with me and very generous. But for 10 years, it took a long time to get their attention and get their approvals to use those photos. So I luckily started the interview process right after my Golden Girls book came out and did well. So the the Will and Grace book. So the Will and Grace book came out in 2004. And by the time I had finished promoting that and was thinking of my next thing, it was 2005-ish time frame. I started putting feelers out about the Golden Girls. And luckily, my husband we lived in New York at the time, but my husband was coming out to LA for 3 months in the spring of 2006 to shoot a game show, I've Got a Secret. And so I knew that we had a good chunk of time in LA where I'd have a hotel room and I wouldn't have to try to get all these LA-based interviews by flying in a week at a time, which is so hard to do because you catch somebody and they say, I can't do it this week, how about next week? And I'm not going to be living here next week.
Right.
So it's very hard to write a book from 3,000 miles away when there are people you need to spend time with in person. So knowing that I would have that spring of 2006, I really set out to do my main interviews. And so I did get time in person with Betty White, B. Arthur, Susan Harris, a lot of writers, a lot of guest stars. I'm glad I started doing all that research in 2006 because it was a show about older women in the 80s. By 2006, Betty and B and Estelle, although Estelle already wasn't well enough to do an interview, but they were all in their mid-80s. And so I did the interviews before I knew what I would be able to do with the book. And that's when I ran into that brick wall of having to worry about rights and whatever. So in order to get a book out about the show, that maybe because never knowing if I would ever be able to get a fuller photo-filled
Right.
deeper dive out there, I wanted to get something out there. And I just happened to meet the publisher of an LGBTQ publishing company, Allison Books, which is no longer in existence. But at the time, they were inaugurating a new series of guidebooks to pop culture and a whole other bunch of things. And so the editor and I discussed, and we said, we could do a discussion of the Golden Girls, particularly as it pertains to the LGBTQ audience and those episodes of most importance to that audience, and do it without photo and really do it as a kind of more academic discussion. So that's what I did, and that's what the Q Guide to the Golden Girls is. The Q Guide was that book series they were starting. And it was a way for me not only to address at least one audience segment that really loves the show, but also to get something out there that everyone involved with the show could see. So B and Betty and Rue and Susan Harris and whatever would see the way I intended to lovingly cover the show, and Disney would see. So it would hopefully warm the door for a bigger approach later, which is what happened. But there were 10 years between those two books, between the Q Guide and between Golden Girls Forever in 2016.
Right, and I have to say, I remember buying the Q Guide, and at that time there weren't really official books, and I feel like that was just the age where people had started to, self-publish books, and there were some, trivia books, and things like that. So when I bought yours, it was with a little bit of trepidation, just because sometimes the quality, isn't there, and you don't necessarily know what you're getting. But it was really, fantastic and professional, and intellectual, which was great. So then, when I heard that you were doing Golden Girls Forever, I mean, I remember two thoughts. The first one was, thank God, and the second thought was about time, because really it was the first, all encompassing, sort of officially endorsed book on the Golden Girls, even though this is, decades after it went off the air. So can you talk, and I know that you've already touched on some of this briefly, but can you talk about, how some of those interviews that you were doing and the connections that you were making, how that sort of helped shape the book? And then beyond that, what did you learn that was surprising to you? Were there things that blew your mind that you weren't expecting, or, hadn't had knowledge of prior to?
There were definitely things that I hadn't read. One of the reasons I wanted to write the Golden Girls book in the first place was, being as old as I am, I remember a time before the internet, and if you were looking for news about a show that you either loved that was on the air, or in the case of the Golden Girls when I was 15, that you knew was in development and wondered what the latest was, there were no resources other than TV Guide magazine and the little TV guides that came in your local newspaper. And so it was hard to find information. When you really were a fan of a show, sometimes there would be guidebooks to a show, but oftentimes I would find that they were written kind of on the fly. They weren't very in depth. Sometimes they even had errors that if you were even a casual fan, you would be like, that's not even right. So it was frustrating as a fan. And, the internet helped with that, certainly. Now there are at least episode guides about just about every show, and any interview anybody's ever done is probably at your fingertips somewhere on the internet. So you can piece together, if you're a super fan of a show, you can piece together information more easily, but it's still not usually published in one easy to use and pretty to look at volume. So that's something I always wanted to do. When the internet dawned and I realized, okay, this is where things are going, and there's still going to be a market for books, because even though there are episode guides out there, they don't tell you a lot of depth. Right. And my first candidate that I wanted to create the book I would have wanted to read was The Golden Girls. In the meanwhile, I was offered through my agent the opportunity to write about Will and Grace, which would have been another show I would have pitched as a book on my own. So when they came to me, I said, yes. And that was great, because that really got me into, I had been writing for TV Guide and other entertainment magazines, but that really got me into the book business and got me a solid credit, so that when I went out to say, now my next idea is something I'm generating, The Golden Girls, it helped, because it helped get all those interviews. You asked how those interviews shaped the book. You can't really go into writing a book about a show with an agenda. You can, if the agenda is just to say, what a great show, and let me tell you all about it. But there's no specific angle that you can hit. And you can make a list of interviewees that you want to get. Obviously, if you're writing about the Golden Girls, you want 4 women, you want Susan Harris, you want some of the prominent writers. But a lot of times, the interviews will lead in an unexpected direction. And a lot of times, your interviewee will say, you know who you should talk to? And then they'll open up their address book and give you a whole bunch of names that you would never have known about. And one of those names could have a story you never suspected existed, about an episode, about the whole show. So you really have to go into it with your research done in terms of who the basic people are that you know are must-haves, but then be open to wherever it leads.
Sure. And I have to ask too, anything, that particularly surprised you that still, these years later stands out as something that you would not have guessed, or just really sort of piqued your interest that wasn't expected?
Some technical thing. Definitely there are things that I just can't remember at the moment, because I don't remember what I knew and didn't know in 2006, because it's been so long that I've been living with this. But there are little technical things. Whenever I find that a show has a thematic or a personnel link to another show, that's always interesting to me, to see how one show influenced another and how everything builds on what came before. And so the Golden Girls owes a lot of debts to the Mary Tyler Moore Show, not just because of Betty White, but because of directors and because of storylines that were familiar to the writers of the Golden Girls that had been touched on Mary Tyler Moore. So it's always interesting to me to see what the antecedent was. When you love something, you get to discover, oh, that's based on this. And in some cases, I haven't seen that. I want to go watch it. That'll give me a better understanding of the Golden Girls. So I definitely love seeing the links. I mean, there were links to All in the Family, where some of the early Golden Girls directors were directors from All in the Family, and that actually didn't work for the Golden Girls. It was a different style, and those directors left early on, and so the Golden Girls evolved away from that. But seeing those links and kind of learning the showbiz history of it was really interesting.
Sure. And I have to ask you too, you did so many fascinating interviews, and it just, not just on camera talent, but, people who are guest stars or people of a different generation who have, enjoyed the show and relate to it, but who were, possibly not even born when the show was on the air,
Right.
or the behind the scenes talent, like you said, writers, producers. So can you talk about some of the people who are a little bit less obvious, maybe that readers will find featured in this book who you might not necessarily think would be in a Golden Girls book, like maybe some of the more contemporary celebrities who are able to reflect on their, relation to it for you?
Well, there are definitely tons of contemporary celebrities who say that they watch the show as fans, and I've been making a list of them to approach about something else. But somebody told me, oh, Christina Aguilera was on one of the late night shows talking about how she watches the Golden Girls every night to go to sleep, and I don't think she was born for the entire run of the show. I'd have to do the math, but I think she's too young. And I meet celebrities a lot. Allison Janney has said that she watches the Golden Girls every night, and I know Ryan Reynolds is a big fan, and we saw that when he did the superhero movie.
Right.
I mean, we saw his B. Arthur T-shirt. So it's really it's always interesting to find out who's a fan, and there are so many because it was such a formative show in a lot of our pop culture experiences. So I'm never surprised to hear of fans, but when I talk about the people, and Deadpool is the word I was trying to come up with when I said the superhero movie. I was like, oh no, I can't name it. What kind of interview is this? When you talk about people behind the scenes, yes, when you write a book, you definitely want to talk to all the principal actors, and when you have people as brilliant as Betty White and the others too, Rue is brilliant, and B, they are going to give you great stories. Not every actor is great at telling stories about their process and what decisions they made, because I found that some actors tend to do things. It's almost right brain versus left brain. Some actors are very intellectual about the approach, and they say, well, I analyzed the script and I realized in that scene that I needed to do this, and I thought, what would be a good head to do? And this is why I did. That's great for an author because they can walk you through it. There are other actors who are just as hilarious and just as talented, but they do everything by feel. And so when you say, why did you react that way in that scene? Or that delivery was so unanticipated. They'll just say, I don't know, it's what I was feeling at the moment, and they can't explain it. So what I find is the best interviews are the writers, because they were involved in that script from moment one, from when it was a germ of an idea to developing it, to making sure that it fit with the B story that they were developing, to seeing where it got slated within the arc of the season. Possibly sometimes they were involved in casting, or at least they had an idea of casting before it was sent off to be cast. And they were on the floor for the taping. They remember alternate joke pitches. They remember working with some of the actors. So the writers are the real through line, writers/producers. And as being writers, they're great storytellers. So they'll often really have the nuggets of gold that you need for the book. But there are also other people behind the scenes that you might not know their names, who are great in that way because they are true lovers of television and students of the form. And I found that in every book I've written, every book I'm working on now. And some of these people, thank God, tend to be pack rats and had collected everything that you'll need for a book that they didn't know why they were collecting. They just hated to see it get thrown away.
Sure.
And my example from the Golden Girls was a director he was an assistant director early on, and he ended up being a director toward the end of the show, and then directed episodes of Golden Palace as well. Lex Passeris. And he just is one of those people who loves show business. He knows everything about show business before, during, and after his time directing sitcoms. And also appreciated all the guest stars when they showed up, took some of them to lunch, even though they didn't have really too much time. And also when Whit Thomas Harris was closing up shop, and they sent out an email to a lot of their employees, literally saying, we're closing and we're throwing things away. If there's anything you want, come dumpster dive. And he did. And he just saved binders and binders of papers. Some of them, I mean, there was a copy of B. Arthur's contract.
Wow.
And I mean, there were just binders of papers that he just grabbed from the dumpster and saved and then cataloged and realized the importance of. And when you talk to people like that, who love the show because they've been taking up cabinets in their office for 30 years with papers that they didn't know why they saved them or why they, were taking up too much space in their house, but they just knew that this was going to be important someday. That's gold. And so my interviews with Lex were amazing. The materials he provided were amazing. And I find that there's one of those angels, as I'm saying it, on just about every show I'm writing about. You find that one person who just, the great repository. And Lex isn't the only one. There was Robert Spina who worked on the show. There were other people who worked on the show who, saved amazing things.
Sure. Well, it's like they were just waiting for you to show up, and I feel like
sometimes it feels that way.
I would be the pack rat. Like, can't get rid
sometimes
of that.
Sometimes it feels that way, and I think, my God, how do I repay you for this? Because there's no money in publishing, so I can't literally pay you. I'm barely getting anything myself. But the idea that you saved this stuff, and then when I, a stranger, call you and say, hey, I'm putting this all into a book, so generous with it. And, you just give it to me and then say, I was always hoping somebody would ask me for this someday. It's amazing. The flip side of that is the number of people who did save things for years, but just being California, there was a fire or a flood or they moved one too many times and said, why am I dragging this all with me? So I have often encountered people who say, I just threw all that away, or I just had a flood in my basement and I had it all. So it can be heartbreaking sometimes too.
Sure.
I really want to be a detective.
Yeah, go through the basement. Yeah. All right, so I have to ask you then, speaking of all these, cherished possessions, do you have a prized possession related to the Golden Girls, something that you value above all else?
I have some things. I mean, someone sent me, I'm looking to see if I can find, Lex actually gave me these Golden Palace playing cards.
Oh, cool.
That was a prop from the show, or I should say a premium to the people who worked on the show. There are a couple of little items that I have like that, or paperwork that I have, or photos that I have that I just think, my God, thank God, first of all, these weren't thrown away and someone saved them. And I hope that when I'm gone, there is and when a lot of people who save this stuff are gone, there is a good repository for it in the TV Academy. I don't think has much of a physical archive. The Film Academy is much better at that. But the Paley Center, maybe, I hope someone keeps the flame alive in the 22nd century. Then when people look back and say, what is this Golden Girls? And it'll probably still be popular, that there will be a place to go to see this in person, or some little thing in person, or like a museum exhibit of photos and paperwork. I just hope that some of the stuff that I have and other people have stays out of landfills and or stays available for the fans.
Yeah, right. I was going to say, I've never seen those cards before. If I come knocking on your door, put them under lock and key.
I know.
So let me ask you I have to ask you to reflect a little bit, because you're fortunate in that you met, I don't know if you met Estelle, but at least 3 of the girls you've met. Can you talk a little bit about what that was like, and how sort of the anticipation of that and the reality of that go together? Like, I met Rue. She's the only one I met, and she was definitely a dynamo.
Yes.
But yeah, you got to dish.
Well, I didn't get to sit with Estelle. When I first had the idea for the book, as I said, when my Will and Grace book came out in September of 2004, I started thinking about Golden Girls. I started contacting people in her life, and I was told at that point, she has mostly bad days, but maybe some good ones. Maybe there's a way. By the time 2006 came around, they were like, I'm sorry, she really is not capable. And of course, I don't want to torture someone and make her feel bad for not remembering or whatever. I did make extra effort to fill out my portrait of Estelle by speaking with her sons and her caretakers and her friends and Harvey Fierstein, who had worked with her in Torch Song Trilogy. So many people who loved her and were able to really make it feel like I knew her, but I didn't. The other three, I sat with in all of their living rooms, and it just worked out that way. I would have met them anywhere, of course. But when I got to LA for that spring in 2006, I put in all the most important phone calls right away to Bea and Betty and Susan Harris. And Susan Harris, I sat with probably a few weeks after getting there. And she and her husband, Paul Witt, were great, gave me a lot of great stories. With Betty, she was at age 84 at the time, so busy that when I called literally in February when I arrived, her assistant said, she has an hour on May 8th at 2 p.m. Would you like that? And I was like, yes.
Yeah.
I was going to be leaving right after that. I was only staying through mid-May.
Right.
So thank God I called when I did, and I got that 1 hour that she had. And the funny thing is, with most people, well, I find this that whether you're on the phone, but particularly in person, if they're having a good time during the interview, suddenly that hard stop that they supposedly have turns out to have been fake.
Right.
And it was just that they didn't want to be stuck with you all day. And so I sat with Betty, and it's funny, when I arrived at Betty's house, which is cheery and butter yellow on the inside, just what you'd think of Betty White. I had just come from another interview with some writers where I had been at lunch, and I had had so much iced tea. By the time I got to Betty's, I rang the doorbell, and I said, and Betty and her assistant both were at the door, and I said, Betty, I'm so sorry, but before I even say a proper hello to you, I must use your bathroom. Is that okay? And she said, oh, I don't have one. I'm that nice. I don't actually go to the bathroom. People just go to the gas station down the street. And I'm like, oh my God, she's doing shtick with me, but I really have to pee. So after using Betty's bathroom, I got to say my proper hello. And her assistant said, okay, she has this hour. And so I quickly set up, and her dog, her golden retriever Pontiac, was lying on my feet. So I'm petting this beautiful golden retriever while I'm talking to Betty. And the great thing about Betty White is that she is so brilliant that she can give you great stories in sound bites. And so she gave me more information in 1 hour than a lot of people gave me in 3 or 4.
Yeah.
And I was watching the time tick away, especially on the little counter on my digital tape recorder. And it's funny because at literally 1 hour and 1 minute on my digital tape recorder, her assistant came in and said, I'm sorry, that's all the time Betty has for today. And it's not that Betty wasn't having a good time, I don't think, but It was that she was that booked up. She later talked on the phone a few times, and she gave me even more time. She was very generous. But that's what it was like being with Betty. It was like having a papal audience, but for that strict 1 hour, because she had that many demands on her time. But in the meanwhile, you're sitting in this beautiful home that's cheery and sun-filled and yellow and a little bit 70s, which is what I think of when I think of Sue Ann, with a golden retriever on my feet, and it was heaven. And then with Bea, I actually had to really cajole her into doing this interview. I've told this story on stage, so I won't tell the whole long version of it. But I was given by the Screen Actors Guild what they called a reference number, which is when someone doesn't really have an agent or anything, they have, which turns out, I didn't realize at the time they gave this to me, it turns out usually to be their personal number. And so I called Bea, and I get this answering machine, hello, I can't come to the phone right now. I thought, oh my God, I've got her home number. So I left her a message, very goody-goody, which turns out to be the complete wrong way to approach Bea Arthur. Yeah. But also playing hardball is also the wrong way to approach Bea Arthur. Never be mean to her, because she was very vulnerable.
Right.
People never suspected that because they thought she was tough, like Maude. She had a tough exterior, but she was very easily hurt and very vulnerable. No, the way to approach Bea was just to lay it on the line and be just no BS, a nice person. And I learned that later. But when I first approached, I was like, Ms. Arthur, I would love to do an interview. And so I remember I was driving, and it was literally the week where California finally passed their law that you couldn't hold a phone handset while driving. And so it was very much on the top of my mind. I'm driving down Santa Monica Boulevard, and the phone rings, and I put her number in my phone. So it comes up, Bea Arthur. And I'm like, holy crap. And so I'm like, I don't care if I get a ticket. So I'm talking to her, and she didn't want to do an interview because, for a lot of reasons, it was in the past. She felt like she'd talked about it enough, which is true. How many interviews had she done on Golden Girls?
Right.
Tons. And then, it turned out she said it wasn't the happiest time in her life. She had divorced her husband shortly before. During season 1, her mother died. So she had had some personal problems during that time. And, she didn't want to go back there. But the interesting thing is she was such a nice person. And maybe part of me was getting through to her that at the end of that first phone call, she said, well, call me again and we'll talk. So even though she would say no every time we talked, which was many times, it was this phone tag went on for a long time. She would say no, but it would be a less emphatic no, and then it would be, well, call me again and we'll talk. And there's whole chapters of this where she called one time when I was in the Beverly Hills Public Library, because those days they had free Wi-Fi and no one else did, and I was in the middle of this big room where there was no way to go take the call anywhere else but in this big room. I couldn't even exit. The exit was so far from where I had all my computers and stuff set up. So I took the call and I'm in the library. I'm like, oh, I'm going to get such hell for this. And sure enough, people are yelling at me, get off your phone. What do you think you're doing? And I'm like, this is B. And like, if I don't take this chain might end and I might never get her. So I ran to the window and the windows don't even open, but I'm hanging into the window well. Like, yes, okay. And she's like, why are you whispering? I was like, because I'm. And finally, some people are yelling at me, get off your effing phone. And I turned around in the moment that my husband loves when I tell this story, I yelled at everybody, like it just a growl, that guttural growl that came up from out of me to everyone in the library. I went, F you, it's B. Arthur. And then I went back to talking to her, and B loved that. I think that's the moment I won her over, where she heard me yell at a library full of people, F you, it's B. Arthur. And so we after a few more rounds of going back and forth, she did invite me over to her home, and we had hours that day of sitting. She had her bare feet up on the coffee table. It was actually a rented home because her sons were renovating her regular home, so they had rented her a house in Brentwood, and so she didn't know where anything was, and it was just her and me in the house. And after we finished our interview, which by the way, she almost threw me out so she could watch Judge Judy, but then I convinced her to let me stay. But after our interview was done, I had agreed to stay and have a drink with her. And the only problem is this was 5 o'clock and I had to get a rental car back to West Hollywood by 6 or I'd get charged an extra day. And so I'm thinking, what can I drink that's the least offensive that I'm not going to get drunk and get pulled over as I race to West Hollywood. And so she picked out a bottle of white wine and she poured the entire bottle of white wine into the 2 biggest balloon goblets I've ever seen. And so much so that I had to slurp it before I could even move it off the counter.
Oh, man.
And so now I'm literally drinking a half a bottle of wine. And I'm a little bit of a lightweight. So half a bottle of wine for me to gulp down and then get behind the wheel is a little much. And we're making small talk. And that's where you have that surreal moment as Bee's got her feet on the coffee table and invites you to kick off your shoes and do the same. That you're sitting there like, I am splitting a bottle of wine with B. Arthur, shooting the crap about Golden Girls, about Maude, about her career on Broadway, about how she loved hag pictures, like Whatever Happened to Baby Jane.
Right.
She was a big fan of hag movies. And so we talked about hag movies. That's one of those moments where, as I said, books aren't lucrative these days. They're often a labor of love. But when you find yourself in a situation that, childhood you would have killed to be in, you do have to take the step back and pinch yourself and say, aha, this is one of those moments. Remember.
Right.
So, and then Rue, I actually, because she lived in New York, I knew that I could wait until I got back to New York to do that interview. And in the meanwhile, I hooked up with the Archive of American Television, the TV Academy's program that does on-camera interviews, and I'd already done many for them. And they said, well, we haven't done Rue. Will you do your interview as part of the Archive of American Television interview? So I did. And so that was done in Rue's living room over the course of 4 or 5 hours. And it was a on-camera interview about her entire career from birth till that moment. And the problem with doing that is that you don't get necessarily enough time to talk Golden Girls if you have to talk about everything. So I had made a deal with Rue and her manager. Poor Rue, this is real torture. Because then even when she had downtime, when they were changing tapes on the camera or touching up her makeup, I could pepper her with extra Golden Girls questions. And so, my God, I tortured that woman because between like half hours at a time, each tape was a half hour long, talking about her entire career. And then when she was supposedly going to get a break, I'd come at her with Golden Girls questions that were completely out of the chronological context of where we'd left off. And so if you actually, that interview in its entirety is available to watch on the TV Academy Archive of American Television website, as are almost all of the interviews I've done. And I recommend watching any interviews they do because, you know, you get to see these people in often their native habitat. They're in hair and makeup, but it's unvarnished, it's archival. Any stumbles or starts and stops are usually left in there. And so it's very telling about the personalities of the people that you love. You can see in that interview how Rue is just not having me toward the end of it. And she's really getting annoyed with me, partly because I never let her rest, and partly because the way the archive does these interviews is they give you, the interviewer, 30 pages of single-spaced questions that you're expected to get through. And 5 hours is not a lot. That's like 1,000 questions. You can't ask anyone 1,000 questions in one day. They just can't handle it. They don't have enough voice to answer. And so what ends up happening is as the person's answering, and especially if one of their answers turns out to be unexpectedly long or maybe touches on another question but not enough, the producer of the interview will start handing Post-it notes to me over my shoulder while I'm barely off camera as it is. And I'll get a note over my shoulder that says skip questions 5 through 10, go to whatever. And so you have to try to not only listen to what Rue's saying, but then, okay, mark that out. No, don't do that one, but skip to this. And it becomes a mental challenge. But also, I start getting nervous that we're going to run out of time and not hit what we need to hit. So I start just talking faster. And not only that, but combining questions. And so I started really, and I can hear myself doing it on the tape, and no wonder Rue was getting annoyed with me. I'm getting annoyed with me hearing it. Where when we get to what TV movies did you do, Rue, rather than saying, okay, well, tell me about this one, and then have her tell me an answer, I started doing this. Well, Rue, in 1976, you did 4 TV movies, and those were called blah, 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 and blah, blah, and then blah, blah. And your co-stars included blah, 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 blah. What did you feel about that? I mean, were they the same? Was it the same during the 4 different movies? Was there a difference between the 4? I'm talking fast. I'm asking 10 questions at once. And I'm asking an older person. Now, Rue was in her 70s at the time, who's already been doing this interview for 3 or 4 hours, who's fatigued. And so there's a couple of moments where you can hear Rue say, if you would just stop and let me answer the question. So I left that day thinking, oh my God, Rue must hate me because I really screwed up and I really was not a great interviewer. And I have to say that she didn't hate me. She was very nice to me afterward. When she passed away, her estate and her executor was very generous with things they gave me to use in the book. And he even specifically said, Rue really loved you. And I thank God Rue was a forgiving person because of all the interviews I did, that is the one that not only has to be on camera and preserved, but where there were so many extenuating factors where, you can watch that interview and you can feel for Rue.
Maybe this will make you feel better, but I met her and I also annoyed her.
I'm not saying I didn't like her. I liked her a lot. I think that she was getting annoyed with me, and rightly so.
Yeah. Well, I'm just saying it must be a thing because, yeah, I totally annoyed her. Like, I met her when her book came out, and it had just come out, and she was doing a play somewhere in New England, and they brought her over to New Hampshire to do a book signing, and we drove all the way there from Connecticut, and she was great. And then a couple of months later, she did a benefit in Bridgeport, Connecticut, and I was like, oh my gosh, Rue's literally in our backyard. We have to go and see her. And so she was disagreeing with me about where she did her book signing because she's like, I've never been to New Hampshire. I'm like, okay, like I have this little poster and everything that says where the bookstore was because it was literally like over the state line. So
Right.
probably didn't know that she was in New Hampshire or wherever it was. And I had just sort of gotten into the book business at that time and I had an arc of her book and she was so offended because she's like, there's typos, there's errors in that book. How do you have that book that I actually I offered to give it back to her? She was like, no, I'm going to sign it for you. But it was funny. There's literally a picture of me and her having words.
Yeah. Well, as an author, I empathize with her because when something that has your name on it is released before it's ready, of course that's mortifying. So I can see her point in that. I mean, and also she was not, being a book author was not her main profession. So
Right.
She didn't necessarily remember the process involves an arc and then, Glad pages and all those things that you only know if you're in this business and they come out and you go through it. So, I empathize with that. And she probably didn't know she was ever in New Hampshire because she probably was, driven to the book signing and here you go.
And that's what I said. And I'm like, here I am reminding her. But I mean, otherwise, she was great. She was such a dynamo, such a good sense of humor. And I remember she was upset because she just had surgery, I don't know, on her foot or her leg or something. And so she couldn't do the Blanche walk. And she really wanted
Ah,
to do the
and
Blanche walk.
that walk was so distinctive, and those slingback shoes with it, the way they would click. Another thing I remember about what troopers they all were, and speaking of signings, is I just put up a photo on my Facebook page to commemorate on September 14th to commemorate the anniversary of the show, and I actually had it made into a watercolor by the guy Mick Dennison, who does that great series Be a Day. He did one Be Arthur painting a day. He turned that painting into a watercolor, which I have right here over my desk. I can probably hold up. Let me try to hold this up and show you. Let me wait, unplug. Can you see it?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that was from the DVD signing, right?
That was from, exactly. So that was from a DVD signing where the girls were appearing in Chelsea, Barnes & Noble in Manhattan and doing this, signing season 3 DVDs for the show. And I lived literally like 4 blocks from the store, so I knew I wanted to go. And that was November 2005. So as I said, I knew that I wanted to write a book about the show. I was formulating the plan, hadn't started the interviews yet. So I thought this is important for me to go and have some FaceTime with them. I had met each of them before, but either as a fan or at at an event quickly, like they weren't going to remember me very well. So I knew I wanted some FaceTime and to say, I'm going to be talking to you. So I go to this book signing, and thank God I got there a little early because the line for that book signing wrapped around, if you know Manhattan, there's short blocks and long blocks. That line wrapped around the long block between 6th and 7th and back again. And that signing, which was only supposed to go for like an hour, went for 3.5 hours or something like that. And the only reason they had to stop is I think they had to go do David Letterman or another talk show. And they tape it like 5. So those women sat there for extra hours just so that more fans would be able to get those DVDs signed and get moments with them and take pictures. And they still ended up having to cut off that line and send people home. And I remember noting the characteristics of the people in that line and noting, it of course was not all old ladies. It wasn't all gay guys. It was every type of person, young girls in sorority sweatshirts singing the theme song. And that just shows you the power of this show. And there were people outside. People had come, I think maybe thinking they wouldn't get in, and they'd made posters that they held up against the windows of Barnes & Noble near where the girls were sitting. And one young girl, held up like a poster board that had written on it, "Betty, will you have cheesecake with me?"
Oh.
And Betty saw it and mimed to her, "Oh," like rubbing her belly, like, "Oh, I'm too full, but I would," and smiled at her. And like that made this girl's day, whether she got in or not. It was an amazing day. And so, talk about troopers. That photo that I took with them, they'd probably been sitting there for hours at that point and had an hour to go because they just were rock stars.
Yeah, it's amazing. I remember seeing that picture and thinking, how did I not know about this signing and why wasn't I there? A little bit of jealousy.
Well, again, Barnes & Noble book signings, you have to be on their list or whatever, or have seen a
Yeah.
poster in their store. I'm sure there are events that I missed like that I would have loved to go to. My Will and Grace book signing was held at Barnes & Noble that still exists on Union Square, and I wasn't told about it until I saw a poster for it the day before. And
Oh
so
my,
I attended my own book signing because to be fair, I'm thrilled that the cast was signing the book. It was a signing for the cast to sign the book. But my name was on the front cover due to one unfortunate person who deliberately did that at the publishing company. I wasn't told about the signing.
oh
So I
man.
showed up at the signing as a guest to get my own book with my name on the cover. And to their credit, that cast, again, were such wonderful people to work with that Eric McCormick, the moment he saw me in the audience, had me stand up and come up and sign with them and introduced me. And, they all were wonderful. They all signed my copy of the book and took photos with me. But, don't feel bad you would have missed the Golden Girls signing because I almost missed my Will and Grace book signing.
Get your own, that's amazing. And the thing I also love about the Golden Girls, I have to say, like, back in the mid 90s, like, you would write them letters and they would respond, like, quickly and all the time. I can't tell you how many things I have signed. And now looking back on it in retrospect, you would think, wow, you sent a picture, to 4 different actresses at 4 different addresses, often in different states, and somehow, they always came
They all
back.
came back.
Even
That
think about doing that today.
They're old school that way. Not that I'm sure there are people who are famous in today's TV schedule who would do that, but there's something about there's some work ethic to the old war horses where they knew to appreciate their fans, a Joan Crawford kind of thing where they would respond to every fan mail. And not that I think we should all deluge Betty at age 98 and a half, but I've seen on Facebook where people are saying, look what came in the mail today, and it's a Betty autograph. So I think she's still doing them.
Yeah, it's amazing. And I used to love, you'd get the pictures and she would sign her name and whatever, animal was featured in the picture with her.
Right, right.
And B. Arthur, I don't know what I was thinking at the time, but this was just when the internet had become a thing, and I found like a B. Arthur Be Naked bumper sticker, with the face on it, and she signed it and sent it back.
Oh, that's amazing. That should be one of your treasures.
I know that. I would say that is my treasure. And you know how the estate of Rue sold off a lot of her items. I actually ended up with like the handwritten journal that she was keeping when they were recording Golden Palace.
Oh my God, that's amazing. That's a real treasure.
Yeah, there's just
If I ever add Golden Palace to the to my book, which I didn't cover for a variety of reasons, mostly because there weren't enough pages to devote to it, I'm gonna look you up for some
knock on
quotes.
my door.
Yeah.
Geez, I was going to pepper you with all kinds of questions, but we've talked so long that I want to let you get back to your evening. So unless, you want to talk about your background, I will start to wrap up. It's entirely up to you, but
I'll talk all night. You can, if you can't tell that already, I'm a talker, so I'll talk all night. You tell me.
All right, well, let me just ask you a couple more questions. Because
Sure.
one, actually, while we're still on the Golden Girls, I'm just going to ask you, and I know this is like asking, who's your favorite child? What's your favorite pet? Do you have a favorite ice cream flavor? But is there an episode or episodes that are either favorites of yours or that just resonate particularly with you for some reason?
Yes, but I'm very much a fair weather friend, and usually my favorite episode turns out to be the one I've just seen. And oh no, that's my favorite. No, that's my favorite. No, that's a good sign when you have a show that you can't decide because every time you watch it, that you realize, that's another one I should have remembered how brilliant it is. Being a gay man, I love 2 episodes with Blanche's brother Clayton. I think those episodes are handled so brilliant. And let's face it, TV is getting, and like all humor is getting more sensitive, but also more restrictive in what you can say and what you can joke about. And there are going to be academics arguing about political correctness and about sensitivity well beyond my time. So I can't give a definitive answer on whether that's good or not. But I can say that what I like about the Golden Girls is that they came down on very loving, compassionate, empathetic views of all these social issues, but not without having their fun as well. And that's a tough balance. And I don't know if it's a balance you can even strike today, because sometimes you can't even joke about things at all. But when, for example, Clayton would show up, they were very supportive of him. Blanche wasn't, that's the storyline, but she would become so by the end of the episode. But the other 3 were very supportive of him. They didn't view him as a lesser person. They didn't whisper behind his back how terrible that he has a male fiance. They were great, but they still made their jokes, and we still got to enjoy them. And some of the brilliant ways they made their jokes is that when Clayton would say something that was an obvious opening for a joke, I love how B. Arthur would grab Estelle by the mouth and cover her mouth, leaving the joke to the audience's imagination. And so they didn't have to say something that would have been demeaning. They let us do it. And so that's a brilliant way to approach the comedy too. I just think that, they had their cake and they ate it too. When they had Jean the lesbian show up, she got a dignified storyline where she fell in love with Rose. Rose handled it beautifully, did not have a gay panic, response and hit her over the head with a frying pan or anything. She let her down in a very loving way, before they got to make all their lesbian jokes. And to me, that's the great balance. You have to be able to laugh at some of these issues and laugh at our own ignorance about these issues, and yet, by the end of the day, show people how a loving person would handle these issues. And I think that the show did such a great job. So whenever I'm asked about a favorite episode, it's Clayton or Jean, or the episode where Dorothy's cross-dressing brother dies, Phil. Because again, they get all their cross-dressing jokes in there, and they have their fun with it. And but by the end, it's a mother mourning her son, and she doesn't care that he was a cross-dresser. She talks about her shame about how she thought she caused it, and about what people thought of her, which is very real. But at the end of the day, it's a mother mourning her son and crying at the end, and it ends on a rare downbeat.
Right.
And to me, that is usually the one I cite as my favorite, because they accomplish so much within that half hour.
Yeah, that was an incredible episode. And I think even now, when I watch them back one, I often find myself thinking, can't believe they got away with that because, it would never fly today. But also they did they covered so many controversial topics or things that just weren't really talked about at the time. Even, the episode where Rose thought she might have AIDS, as you mentioned, Blanche having a gay brother who wanted to get married. And of course, the great episode with Jean, who Blanche thought was Lebanese. And of course, what's wrong with that?
Right.
But yeah, it's I love that, it's still so timely and there's always something relevant and resonant to talk about in today's world.
And
Um,
unfortunately, getting more timely all the time. I mean, I've been watching a lot of All in the Family lately too, and both that show and then some episodes of Golden Girls. I had gotten a little complacent during the Obama administration, thinking, "Oh, good, I'm so glad we've moved past that issue, or moved somewhat past that issue." And now you watch the episode where, the episode with Mario Lopez of the Golden Girls, where he was a prize-winning student who wrote an essay about what it means to be an American, and then the equivalent of ICE came and took him away and deported him. There's no happy ending. And I would have thought during the Obama administration, oh, I think that maybe we're being a little better
right.
we have with Dreamers, we have the Dreamers program, and we have these other, maybe it's nope, we've got goon squads pulling people off the street and deporting them and ruining their lives and the lives of their family.
Right.
And we're back where we were, if not further back, when that episode aired. So unfortunately, some of these social issue episodes seem more timely lately rather than less.
It's very true. Very true. All right. If you don't mind, a couple more general questions for people who want to know, who you were before you are now and sort of how you made it down that path. So let me ask you, I mean, you've been in, media journalism for a long time now. And if I understand correctly, this goes back to your college days. You were an editor at, what was it, the Daily Pennsylvanian. So can you talk about your general interest in the field of entertainment and how you've sort of traveled that path with touchstones here and there, because it's been sort of a lifelong thing for you.
It's been a lifelong aspiration, but the weird thing is it really doesn't go back to college. This is a mid 20s or around when I was about 30-year-old career change. I actually, as I said, I was a kid who was obsessed about television. And I remember in high school when we would be asked about what you wanted to do as a career, I was like living a double life. Part of it was honestly like living a double life because I was in the closet.
Right.
I let my parents boss me into going into computer science because that's what my father did. And they claimed they would only pay for college if it was computer science. And I realize I'm lucky to have anybody pay for college for me at all, so I'm not complaining. But it was just it was a weird fork in the road to encounter really early on, and whenever I would be honest, when we would do, your guidance counselor would send you some kind of what career is for you test, and they'd feed it into the computer and it'd spit out what they thought you should do, which is kind of a crazy idea anyway. But whenever I'd be honest, it would come out liberal arts and would come out, you want to be a writer, you want to be a columnist, you want to be a journalist. And I'm thinking to myself, yeah, I do. But I had to say, no, I'm going to pursue computer science. So I went to the University of Pennsylvania and I was in this program called Management and Technology that was a dual degree program. One of the degrees was from Wharton in business and the other one was from the engineering school in computer science. And so I got that degree over 4 years, but I liked a lot of the Wharton classes because business is actually interesting to me, but I'm a terrible science student and I'm not a great computer science student. I'm interested to a point, but not like a lot of the nerds were. And so I would get a week into the class and be like, yeah, I've had enough of that. That satisfied my curiosity about Pascal. I don't really care anymore. And there'd be the rest of the semester to go. So to keep me sane, I took extra classes in liberal arts stuff. I took French and Italian and creative writing and volunteered for the Daily Pennsylvanian, and they had a magazine called 34th Street, which was more like the features magazine within Daily Pennsylvanian. And I became the film editor for a while there and also wrote entertainment feature pieces. And that was really just to keep for my sanity. Because if I had to go home and study computer science textbooks and chemistry, because I had to take chemistry and physics, oh my God, I hated those. If I had to study that stuff all night, I would just want to kill myself. So I would really not devote nearly enough time to those difficult subjects that I was not good at because I preferred to devote time to these subjects that I enjoyed. So I got terrible grades in computer science, and I managed to get that degree, and I went into consulting, where I worked for a couple of different firms where I was building computer systems right out of college for the first few years, but I hated it. And it was a lot of travel to sometimes great places. I mean, I lucked out that I got to spend a year in Washington, D.C., all expenses paid at a client site. And I loved Washington, D.C. And in my personal life, as somebody who's questioning coming out, Washington, D.C. is a great place to do that. But then I got sent to Appleton, Wisconsin, and Chattanooga, and small towns where I would be living in a hotel, programming by day and watching Nick at Night by night to stay sane. And I thought, there's got to be a better career than this, because I'm not going to last. I'm not that great at this stuff. And so I started, when I met my husband and he was on contract for TV Guide, I actually had a magic opportunity, which was that he had written about The Sopranos several times. And there was a casting call. This is, I think, 1999. So I was literally 30 or turning 30 that year. There was a casting call for The Sopranos that was being held at a little high school in New Jersey near where I grew up. And my husband, Frank, was going to go cover it for TV Guide, but they wanted him to do it incognito. In other words, what is the experience like covering, going to a Sopranos casting call? But at the last minute, they realized, wait a minute, that he's interviewed them several times. They're going to recognize him. And they didn't have anybody else to go. And they figured, I'm from New Jersey. I've got a vowel at the end of my last name. Send me. So they asked, do you want to do it? And I was like, this is a chance to get in the door at TV Guide and do something like I enjoyed doing in college and haven't been able to do since, because I've been focusing on this career that's driving me crazy. And so I did cover that casting call, which ended up being shut down by the police because it was at a zoo. It attracted like tens of thousands of people to this little town and got shut down. So that was a whole other story. But it got me in the door at TV Guide, and I just kept freelancing for them. And then eventually, after I had worked for them for a year or two and written now this Will and Grace book, I thought, okay, it's time to leave the day job behind. And I had also transitioned from pure computer work to work in an advertising agency where I worked in media research. So it was more about numbers rather than computers. Still not what I wanted, but a little bit less hardcore. And even that, once I saw that books could not sustain me financially, I mean, they haven't necessarily. And luckily, I have a husband, and we are yin yang and comprising a paycheck. But it at least was, okay, I can focus on what I love, which is really the advice. That's my long-winded story. The moral of my long-winded story is that that's what I should have done at age 18, and what I would advise everybody else to do. Don't get roped into a major that if it's a major that you think you might like, fine. If you know it's wrong for you, don't do it. You're just going to set yourself on the wrong path for years, maybe a decade, and torture yourself. Don't torture yourself. Do what you love, because they say the money will follow, and in some ways it does, but also the happiness follows.
Well, you're just taking the questions right out of my mouth, because I was going to ask you a little bit about that. But, computers really could have been a fad, so they can
Yeah,
still...
those computers, they're never going to last.
No, but I wanted to ask you, and you just touched on this, but one of my questions to you is going to be, people who have a passion for a certain topic, whether it's a television show or something separately, and, they're doing something that they might not enjoy, even if they can't make a living, following that passion. Do you have another word of encouragement that you would give them as to, how maybe they can start to go down that path and find some creative fulfillment in that?
Well, yes. I mean, the good news about the way things are today in the industry, the way the industry is structured of entertainment, and I guess you could say this about other industries too, I just don't know how they work as well. But there's so much opportunity to create things on your own now with the technology we have, that if you're doing it for the love of it, and you're not waiting for, you don't think, oh, I'm going to write one book and be famous, or I'm going to write one TV script and it's going to get discovered and made and I'm going to be famous. You can't have short-term thinking like that, because it'll drive you crazy, and the odds of that happening are so slim. But if you're creating because you enjoy the creation and think it may lead to a career, and maybe someday you can leave a day job, that's, I think, pretty good. And there are ways today in the old days, if you wanted to get a job as a writer on a TV show, which is one of the hardest jobs to get, because there are so few TV shows comparative to the population. There's millions of people out there who would love to do that job, and there are how many sitcoms, and each sitcom hires 8 to 10 people. It's a hard job to get. So in the old days, if you wanted that job, for example, you would have to write a spec script, a sample script for a show, and then just getting anyone who had the power to get you into Hollywood to read it was a job in itself. These days, you don't really even have to write a spec script. If you perform, if you write a skit that you circulate somehow on social media, if you perform something on YouTube or TikTok and all these platforms that I'm too old to really understand, but you can get noticed for something that you love. And I'm not just saying as a performer. I mean, look at all the people who have become well known as designers, as singers, as crafters, by doing YouTube videos, or as chefs, by doing what they love and putting it out there. So I think the encouraging thing is if you still have time after a soul-sucking day job and you get home at 5 or 6 o'clock or later, and you still have the energy to film yourself doing something, or to sit down at a computer and write something, or to paint something, or to, whatever it is that you do, there are more ways to share your art with the world than there ever were. And so, again, don't expect instant fame. I think we're built in a society, unfortunately, that expects instant fame. But if you're doing it for the love of it and it's going to keep you sane, you will find somebody who appreciates you, and that's great.
That's great advice. And I think you're right. We're so fortunate to live in an age where there really is a forum for everything and everyone. And if there's not, you can pretty easily create it yourself. So one more question, well, actually maybe two, but I've been asking people this question. It's sort of piggybacking on what you just said, but I've started to think of maybe, I want to do like little snippet segments where I pull points out from these interviews and do like a little Wednesday wisdom for writers where it's just a snippet and not necessarily a deep dive conversation. So even if you're, drawing on the answers that you just provided, sort of briefly, just can you tell me, the best advice that you ever got in terms of a creative life, and then the best advice that you never got, had to learn yourself and wish maybe somebody could have told you sooner?
Wow. Okay. I have gotten a lot of great advice, but I really have to think what would be the best piece. I mean, I do think that as a writer, you really want to not show your work until it's ready. And you have to be honest with yourself about when it's ready. And it's very tempting. I'm talking scripts, but because that's my experience, but I'm sure it's true of fiction and even nonfiction writing of all kinds. You may finish the first draft and think, oh my God, my baby, I'm in love with it. Take a minute, take a beat, take a day or two away from it, go back to it, revise, really make sure there are no spelling errors. Really know when is the right time, and be honest with yourself about when you are ready for the big time. If you're asking someone to take their time to consider your work. If you're just doing it for fun, or you're putting it up yourself on your own YouTube channel and you feel it's right, that's different. But especially if you're asking someone to take time out of their career to consider your work, which is what needs to happen, because we all need a champion to discover us and give us a gig. So I think that was the advice that I don't know if it's the best advice I got, because I've gotten a lot of good advice and I wish I could think of it all right now. But I do think it was probably the toughest advice for me to take, because I was of the camp who was like, look, and I wrote a spec script of Friends and it's brilliant and I'm going to be hired tomorrow. And A, it didn't work out that way. And B, I don't think what I wrote was probably ready.
Sure. And there's always somebody to tell you that, yes, you present this cute baby and they say, actually, it looks like somebody dropped that baby on its head. There's something wrong with that baby.
And it's hard to hear. It's a skill to develop the ability to take notes, and the ability also to know what notes not to take,
Right.
because it's ultimately up to you what you craft creatively. And if you ask 10 people, you may get very conflicting advice. I don't think you should ask 10 people unless you're in a writer's group that they're reading it all at once. But if you ask multiple people, you'll get conflicting advice, and you have to parse through it and know what to, okay, this is something I should address. this is something that is not that important. It's hard, and it's a skill, and I don't think anybody ever perfects it completely. But
Sure. And was there anything that I know you talked about, you were sort of pushed on a path earlier in your career that wasn't necessarily for you and you kind of knew it, but you didn't want to say anything. Would that be the advice that you would say, you wish, you had known that to begin with, or you wish you had followed that advice, but it took sort of the experience of living through the wrong career to find, your path to the right career? Or is there something else, that you've learned in this journey that you wish you'd known sooner, but you sort of just had to learn by the experience of going through it?
I do think that one of the main things that I mean, I'm happy where I am now, but it took a while and some painful moves to get here. And I think any career is going to take that painful move. So I don't know whether I would have, the road not taken is always tempting to wonder about, but who knows what would have happened had I gone to school. Like some of the writers I admire went to Emerson College in Boston, and they had a liberal arts degree, and then other people I know, even from Penn, who often did have liberal arts degrees, moved out to LA right away and got into television in their 20s, when you're more malleable, when you can afford, to get paid dirt as a production assistant, and you're less set in your ways. And they made it big, and they put in their dues. And I think that's all great stuff. Had I done my career that way rather than working in corporate America for, until I quit corporate America when I was 32. So, that was 10 formative years that I maybe would have been a production assistant and worked my way up. Who knows? But I would say that the thing that I do think is definite is that you should like what you do. And, I know there are people out there who get pressure to be doctors or lawyers or whatever. And if you like that, that's great. I mean, what a great thing, because the world needs them, and it happens to be pretty lucrative. But if you don't, you're just going to torture yourself. So follow what you love.
True. And do you really want to be the person who gets the doctor that doesn't really want to be a doctor?
Yeah, I say that too. I have a friend who's studying engineering now, and I always say, like, are they really going to say we want to get that guy to build the bridge who didn't want to be an engineer? Or, do you want to get the lawyer who's only half paying attention because he really would rather be a tap dancer and just never had the guts to go for it? I mean, it can be problematic. Do you want somebody operating on you who really would rather be singing?
Yeah, go test that one out. All
Yeah.
right, so I will let you get back to your evening, but my final question for you, I have to ask, I mean, you seem to be working on all different kinds of things all the time, but can you tell us a little bit about, what's occupying your time these days, and also if you may have another book or books in your future?
I'm actually working on two books right now. One I can't talk about yet because they haven't told me not to talk about it, but it hasn't been announced, so I guess I shouldn't.
Which is
The other,
very often you do. So,
and it's a good one. It's really going to be fun. And come out. It'll come out first of the two things I'm talking about, so I can't wait to see it. But the other thing is I've been working for years, so people on social media are probably sick of me saying this, on a book about the Love Boat. And the reason why I say they're sick of it on social media is because the Love Boat had a guest star format, and so the story of that show is housed among all of those thousands of guest stars who appeared on the show. And so tracking them down is a job in itself. And often on social media, I'm writing posts on Facebook like, hey, here's a list of people I'm looking for. Who knows how to find this person or that person? And it's become a team sport. But one of the great things about working on that, and honestly, one of the great things right now about being a writer is that as a writer, often you're used to working alone and not going into an office. And it's been an adjustment for a lot of people, and I know it's how hard it must be to work from home during this quarantine. But for me, that's what I've been doing for years. And also, talking about something like the Love Boat, I found this in approaching these interviewees, that people are very happy to talk about the Love Boat at this moment. First of all, it's easier to get them on the phone because they don't have many excuses. They can't say, I have a lunch date. No, nobody's going out to lunch.
Yeah, right.
If I contact you, it's going to be hard for you to say, I'm busy all next week. I'm never going to be home. Yeah, you're probably going to be home a lot of the time. We're all stuck at home. But the other thing is, and I found a lot of my interviewees have said this at the end of the interview, they say, I really had a great time reminiscing about The Love Boat, it took my mind off 2020 and brought me back to 1984
Right.
or 1982 or 1978, a time that, where I have good memories, and I can remember what that show was about, being lighthearted and all about love. And so for me to be able to dwell in that space for a good portion of my day is very therapeutic. It keeps me off of Twitter, keeps me out of flame wars with trolls who as it is, I wrote an op-ed last week about the Golden Girls and how loving it was, and how basically my thesis, which was originally the title of the piece, and it ended up being retitled. But my thesis was, if you're a Trump supporter, stop watching the Golden Girls. And it's because you don't get it. That show was all about love and acceptance. And if you can turn off a show that tells you that it's okay to be a lesbian, or it's okay to be to have a gay brother, or that AIDS is not a punishment for a bad person, and all those things that the Golden Girls said, if you can flip off the TV, put on your MAGA hat, and go to a hate rally, there's no hope for you. So, I have very strong feelings, and if I were left alone to those feelings on Twitter, I probably would be getting myself into trouble. So it's really good to have The Love Boat to bring me back to 1978 in my head, when I was an 8-year-old home on Saturday nights watching a show about people falling in love, and I think it lowers the blood pressure right away.
Right. Talk about escapist entertainment. And,
Yeah, that's right.
I have to say, I was, escapist entertainment and sort of reliving good times. I'm going to remind people that they need to pick up Golden Girls forever. I was going to hold my real book cover, and then I realized that, to extricate it would risk the great book avalanche of 2020. Holding it up on my Kindle.
This whole time I've been admiring your backdrop there. Is that a curtain with books on it?
Oh, you want to know the truth, do you? That is my shower curtain.
That's your I love it.
Thank you.
That's amazing. I've been admiring this booktop the whole time. And I only recently, I'm not very bright, so I only recently realized it was a curtain. For the first half hour we were talking, I was thinking, how did he get the books to curve like that?
I know, there's weird ripples.
There's ripples, and he organized the books so that they form like a wave pattern. I'm a moron. So basically, I only realized it was a curtain right before I said it.
Yeah, hey, whoever would have thought I'd be spending so much time in my bathroom? I'm like, well, I guess the pandemic has been good for something.
It's the acoustics. The acoustics are good in the bathroom.
They really are. It's amazing. Good lighting, privacy. Nobody wants to be in here.
Oh, what? Can't imagine why. I hope you're not sitting where I think you're sitting. I hope this is.
I will tell you. I drag in a chair, extra lighting. I call it Studio B, and people are like, "That's so professional." I'm like, yeah, the B is for bathroom, and there is no Studio A, but
I thought you said Studio P, actually. So that would have been.
We might get there. We're devolving. I guess we should stop now, huh?
Yeah, probably pretty much.
I don't know. I think we're friends. Dare I say it? Thank you for being a friend, Jim Colucci.
Thank you for being a friend, John.
That's it for this episode of Central Booking. Thanks for watching, and be sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss a thing.